Reformed Devils. I'm Jonathan Barth, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University and Associate Director of the new Center for American Institutions. And of course, with me is my co-host, Dr. Owen Anderson, Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies, also at ASU. Today, we're very excited to have Arizona State Representative and House Majority Leader Ben Toma to talk about the latest victory for school choice in Arizona. But first, if this is your first time watching Reformed Devils podcast, I reckon we have a few first-time viewers. We are, that is Dr. Anderson and I, two God-fearing, Christian, confessionally reformed professors, once dead in our sins, but now made alive in Christ, not through any achievement or work that we've done, but through faith, which itself is a free gift, an unmerited gift of grace. So faith alone, by grace alone, in Christ alone, so that on that day of judgment, we and all other believers, that's believers of every tribe, tongue, and nation, will stand before God clothed not with our own filthy rags, but clothed with the righteousness of Christ, who out of an abundance of love, infinite love, bore the sins of his people on the cross and defeated death, conquered death for us so that we would have life, real life, everlasting life. And that's the gospel, isn't it, Owen?
Amen. I love it. You're giving your introductory sermon is great.
Hey, we got lead with the
that's right.
Yeah, yep. Call it the gospel truth.
And that's why we're Reformed Devils. Of course, a play on the name for the Sun Devils. And we're Reformed. So Reformed ASU guys are called the Devils, and we're Reformed Devils. But also recognizing, as John said, we're born dead in our trespasses and sins. So we're born needing a new heart. And we're here to talk. We've been talking about a number of academic things, about things like critical theory, critical race theory in education. And so today we get this great chance to talk with Representative Toma, who has really, once again, we've made Arizona a leader in school choice. And choice is such an important thing in education, something everybody should affirm, our need to be able to have students have choices, the parents of students have choices. And so Arizona already had a really great state tax system where you could direct a portion of your taxes to the school or educational system you'd want. And it was already a leader in the United States for that. Well, now we have a great ESA program, and they're both so good that I know parents who aren't sure, that they're not sure which one to use because they're both such great options for them. We have this great ESA program where each student will get $6,500 that their parents get to decide, as K-12, where those funds go. And that could include a private school or homeschooling. And so there's lots of questions that might come to mind. We want to ask those today. First, can you just tell us about your philosophy of education? I mean, tell us why you thought this would be a good idea and how that relates to the way you think about the state and education and parents.
Sure. Well, thank you, gents, for having me on. I appreciate it, and looking forward to the discussion. In terms of why, to me, I always just kind of thinking back to my K-12 years, it never made sense to me that every child would be treated the same. It didn't. Children are different. I'm assuming you see the same thing at the university level. They have different levels of interest, different talents. God has wired each of us in a different way. Some are better at math and science. Some are better at English and wordsmithing, and some are better at art. Thankfully, I don't ask me to paint anything because it'd be pretty scary. But and so to me, I think the people best positioned to make the decision on how to best educate their children are parents, because they know them. You've raised them, you've given birth to them, in the case of a mother, of course, and you know how God has wired them, you know where their talents are, and you know what their needs are. And the one size fits all might work for the majority of kids, but it really doesn't for some. So that's the kind of the starting principle. Plus, I do have to admit, especially as an immigrant to this country, from communist Romania, I can say that they obviously took it to another level in terms of state down kind of imposed education and indoctrination and so on. And to some extent, you're seeing certain people here wanting to do the same sorts of things in the K-12 space. And so the best check on that I could think of is to do a universal school choice, which, as you rightly pointed out, is unique in the US. It's the first state that's already done it. Having said that, I fully admit that there is no way we could have done this without being already pro school choice as a state, right? It's 25 years of advancements in school choice, everything from open enrollment in the public school system to charter schools that are so popular in Arizona.
Yeah.
The original ESA program, which was passed 11 years ago, and it's been extended since. And now, truly, we're at a place where we have backpack funding. The only thing I will correct you on is it's now about $7,000 per child because of the increases that we've done to the base level funding. And since the ESA is 90% of the state's fund, it gets pretty complicated. We won't get into school finance, but the point is, it's about $7,000 per child.
Okay. Well, you said a few things that raise questions. The first one is parents are the best to know. And it seems like when COVID happened and kids were at home on Zoom, parents suddenly started seeing what's going on in the classroom. And you see this across the nation, parents showing up at school board meetings and saying, wait a minute, this isn't the curriculum we want for our children. Did you notice anything about that in Arizona?
Absolutely. I have to also admit that I don't think this would have been possible, at least not now, without COVID and what happened. And it's kind of an interesting situation, right? Because remember what happened, beginning of 2020, right? You've had COVID was starting to be a thing. People started to hear about it. March comes around, all these shutdowns happen. Okay, for the first few weeks, it was a bit uncertain, right? Nobody knew how serious this would be. So let's give everybody the benefit of the doubt. But then after that, you saw, and I can just anecdotally tell you what happened up in my area, which is the northwest part of the valley. There were charter schools. There were lots of charter school options up there. Some of them had wait lists. Many of them didn't. Well, after COVID and after the public schools decided for the most part to stay shut and to have certain rules and whatever implemented, charters didn't and made different decisions. And now all of a sudden in 2021, if you're trying to get your child into a charter school up there, again, where I'm at, you're talking about a 1, 2, 3, in some cases, 4-year wait list.
Wow.
Now. And remember, these are A+ schools up there on the public side. So it's not that all of a sudden parents have changed. That in conjunction with the fact that, as you said, it's the age-old out of sight, out of mind, right? Where parents just didn't really, of course, parents care fundamentally, but if it's not right in front of you, often you can't tell and you're not really paying attention. And so now kids are at home. They're asking parents for help in some cases, or parents are just kind of watching their children since many, like we have 5 kids, and so they're in different parts of the house trying to zoom in, going to school at the same time. You can't help but overhear what they're talking about, and it was an opportunity for parents to finally really see, wait a minute, this is you're done. And again, every school did it differently. So one example. One of our daughters was at a school that the professors or teachers would just record everything, and all they had to do is watch this thing every day, and she'd be done in less than an hour with their school day. And I'm going, wait a minute, what's just happened here? How are you done in less than an hour? And you've seen the learning loss. I'm sure you guys have probably talked about that. And if not, that might be something for you to focus on in the future. How much learning loss and how much children fell behind, especially those in some of these schools that are shut down. So yeah, I think the fact that COVID happened opened the eyes of many parents in America to what was actually happening. And going back to what I said earlier, I couldn't think of a better way of adding a check on public schools and ensuring that parents have an option than to go to full-on backpack funding. And I fully expect, by the way, before anybody accuses me of this, I'm not anti-public school. I'm not anti-charter school. I'm not anti-private school, and I'm not anti-homeschool.
That's one of the questions we want to
these
come up with.
Yeah, exactly. I'm all for all of these things, and that's the beauty of the choice. We didn't change the STO program, as you mentioned, the tax credit program, at all, because that's another form of choice, and that would be antithetical to what I'm trying to do.
John, I think you had a question.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, in reading up last night in preparation for this, I saw a great quote from you, Ben. You said, in Arizona, we fund students, not systems, because we know one size does not fit all students. Isn't I mean, this seems like common sense to me. And then you look at the polling. I saw a recent poll. It was from February of this year from Real Clear Opinion Research. 72% of those polled, and this was a Republican, Democrat, Independent, 72% support school choice, including, get this, 68% of Democrats. 68% of Democrats support school choice. By the way, in support of your thesis there of COVID changing things. Before COVID, it was lower, but COVID, those numbers have gone up. 68% of Democrats, 70% of African Americans, 77% of Hispanics support school choice. And yet the Democratic candidate for governor has come out and said that she would veto the school choice bills. How do you think the opposing party gets away with opposing something that's so broadly popular among a wide, diverse range of groups?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I don't think they do, or they're starting not to get away with it as much as they have in the past. To start there first, you see what happened in Virginia. It happened before we attempted to do what we ended up being successful in doing. And you're talking about a blue state, for all practical purposes, that elected a governor that was all about, and there were multiple issues there, but really the primary one that rose to the top was school choice and the abuse of some of the discretion of the public schools in Virginia. So if a blue state can turn red, at least at the governor's level, then that should be pretty obvious, not just the poll, but that voters are actually willing to carry through with those voting behaviors based on those beliefs. So in terms of what's going on within the party, within the Democrat Party, it's not about even teachers ultimately, although they say that, or about students. It's about teachers' unions specifically. Mm-hmm. And the teacher union in particular does not want to give up any sort of turf to parents, yep. And definitely not to conservatives, mm-hmm. which is again antithetical to control. Now, their only idea has been that if they have all the control, and they do have overwhelming influence on the Democratic Party, and as a Democrat, you have to get through a primary in order to get to a general, right? So that's the challenge. Politically, that's the structure that's enabled them to keep the control for as long as they have. But I think the gig is up. I mean, the curtain has been drawn. You see, parents now see what's behind it. And to your point, of course, I fundamentally believe that parents do care overwhelmingly what their children are learning, and not that most parents want to be helicopter parents, right, hovering over to try to control every little thing. But when they see that their children are not learning anything useful, when they see that they're being indoctrinated, when they see abuses and one particular ideology overwhelmingly being pushed down their throats, I mean, that you're seeing it happen. This could not have happened without parents finally opening their eyes.
Yep.
Yeah. And so picking up on that idea that parents had a view into their kids' schools, and they're seeing that one political viewpoint, one political philosophy is being pushed. What do you think stood out to them? I mean, why is that able to happen in K through 12? Aren't we supposed to just teach objective truths like math and reading? How does it get so politicized?
Well, whenever you have people involved in any sort of process, it's going to get politicized, and there's always a bias. It's ridiculous to me, especially as a small interest in philosophy that I have. It's interesting to me to hear people say, "Well, this is objective." Well, okay, well, we can argue about what objective actually means, but generally, most people think that objective means 2 + 2 = 4, which is a standard thing. Well, now you can't define what a woman is. Well, biologically, it should be objective using that same sort of basic knowledge or logic that I mentioned before. But so when you see one side go so far as to start redefining what words mean, if there is no difference between a male and a female, then 2 + 2 doesn't have to equal 4.
Yep.
And that means that if my truth is just as good as your truth, in other words, if my opinion is just as good as the factual truth from a scientific standpoint, then God help us later on if I have an engineer that says, you know what, I don't care if you think I failed calculus. My truth is better than your truth, and so therefore you have to pass me. Well, I don't want to cross that bridge. I don't want to drive in that vehicle, or in that airplane or whatever. So I think they pushed it too far. That's the long way.
We just saw NYU fired a leading chemist, a chemist who'd come to NYU from Princeton, because students complained that the organic chemistry class was too hard. And I don't know the details of what those complaints were, but this was the person who basically wrote the textbook for organic chemistry. And you're going into organic chemistry probably because you're going into medicine. So picking up on your example of the engineer, right? How about the medical doctor? And now your medical doctor said, hey, my organic chemistry was too hard, and got their professor fired. So you're seeing that kind of thing happen. Now I want to brag a little bit too, real quick, because Representative Toma graduated from the same campus I teach at, and he took philosophy there. And you can see that coming out as he answers that question. He says he has just a little interest in philosophy, but I want to give him more credit than that.
Yeah.
You've said a word a couple of times. I want to pick up on that. I think a person who's opposed to state funding or the ESA program will hear the word God. You've said things like God made our children, God gave them, made them an image of God. And then you just said, God forbid this, that happen. Isn't that going to be the fear that all of a sudden religion infuses itself into a state education? There's some kind of violations of the First Amendment?
Well, I think keeping God out of it is a violation of the First Amendment, personally. The notion that atheism, now since you brought up philosophy, I can't let this go.
Good, do it.
The notion that atheism is somehow secular, whatever that means, it's not secular. It's a religion, just like any other religion. It's belief about the unknown. And they're simply saying that they don't believe that it exists, or they don't know, and so therefore they're not going to act on it. But it's a belief. It's not a scientific viewpoint specifically, in the sense that it's proven to be correct.
So forcing religion out is just as much of forcing God out is just as much a violation then, because you're replacing that with some other religion.
Well, that's exactly right. And as I mentioned before in the previous question, every teacher has a bias. Every professor has a bias. To ignore that is to be ridiculous. You have to just know that that's the case. So the question is, it's not about trying to eliminate a bias, which is impossible as long as human beings are part of it. Even the way something is written, even if you just put a child in front of something that's written as opposed to something that's, say, taught actively by a professor, it's the same thing. There's bias in the way it was written because somebody wrote it, and there's a bias there. So for me, the issue isn't so much about bias. It's about making sure that all viewpoints are equally available. And again, I have control over my children, and I should retain primary control over my children. Even Democrats agree with that, over what they're taught and how they're taught. So to me, that's the first thing. But I do want to touch on something else that you kind of hinted at, but we didn't really talk about.
Yeah.
And that's the concept of, if you're, money going to say pay for state money going to pay for private or religious education, right? Is that not wrong? Shouldn't it just stay in the public realm?
Right.
Well, first of all, I'm going to pick that up because it's come up so many times it's sort of ad nauseum. There is no such thing as state money. It is our money. The state does not, aside from the fact that the Fed seem to be printing it ad nauseum, but outside of that, it's not their money. It's not the state's money. It is our money.
Mhm.
It is taxpayer funds. So it's really what you're saying when you're saying that is, and you didn't say it, but you understand what I mean.
Yep.
What someone says when they're saying that is that my money, my personal money, should go to fund, say, an atheist perspective in a public school, but not to fund a Christian perspective in a private school.
Mhm.
And that to me is wrong fundamentally. So I have
Well,
no
especially
problem.
given, it's interesting given your background, you can speak to that because you told us earlier, an immigrant from communism, and you bring that, you know what happened.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. Remember, the communists were atheists in theory. In practice, that's a whole different thing. But in theory, they were all atheists.
Yep.
And so, and they're very anti-religion. Religion was very a social thing at best, but not in theory. That every decision that they made was irreligious, which is absolutely not true. But that's a whole different subject. We won't go there. Maybe another time.
So I had two questions. Oftentimes you'll hear opponents of the ESA system from the Save Our Schools folks say that ESAs will, this is a quote, codify segregation, end quote. I was wondering if you could answer that. And then number two, maybe you can sort of combine the two answers. Opponents often call these vouchers. Can you explain how ESAs are different from vouchers and why that word vouchers is not used in the legislation and why that's important?
Well, it's not a voucher. The first and foremost, I don't pretend to be an expert on all the differences between the two, but the ESA system is a contract between the parent and the state. It has nothing to do with the school itself. So that's partially why it's different, and it's also why it's been litigated in the past and has survived, because it is not a voucher from the state to a private school. It is a contract between the parent and the state. So the contract is pretty straightforward. For those that have seen it, you know what I mean. Essentially, it says that you will use part of the funds to teach your children the basics, math, reading, writing, and so on. And that's about as prescriptive as it gets, and that you aren't going to commit fraud, and you're only going to use it for the items that are approved, right? So if you're using an ESA to go to a private school, then it's pretty easy, because you can use the funds to pay for the tuition and certain other, maybe perhaps extracurricular activities if you have excess money left over. But on the homeschool side, it's where it gets a little more complicated. There are lists of items that can be reimbursed. There are certain vendors that are set up just for ease of payment, where you can submit and sort of goes directly to them. But again, from a legal standpoint, the contract is between the parent and the state, not between the state and some private or third-party institution.
So it follows the pupil, in other words.
Follows the pupil.
Yep.
That's exactly right. And because of that, the courts have said it's not a voucher, and as such, it's been deemed legal. That's been litigated. Even this round, as you know, SOS tried to stop the program altogether, but they did not even bother trying to litigate, because that issue has been settled. So that's the first thing. And you had a first part of your question.
Yeah, you see this charge a lot that from the opposing side, Save Our Schools people, that this will codify segregation. How do you answer that? Yeah, yeah.
That just roused me up. Because I mean, think about it. It's like they've said that before, and I remember saying to one of my Democrat colleagues when they made that accusation, it might have been committee, I forget, but he was saying that, well, this only benefits the rich, right? Which gets at the same idea of segregation. And I'm going, hold on a second.
Yeah,
the rich already have access to private
Yeah.
school.
yeah,
They're already there. The segregation, if you want to call it that in that sense, is already there that way. This would just give everybody the opportunity to go to a private school. And
Right.
yes, I understand the private schools don't pop up instantly when the bill passed, which some people have they've already said, well, see, we don't have more private schools. Well, first of all, it's been finally settled for what, a couple weeks now, 3 weeks maybe. So it's ridiculous that they would even go there. But really, this is all about having access everywhere. And by the way, during the committee hearing, we had a gentleman named Drew Anderson, who was a pastor in South Phoenix and former NFL player, really good guy, came and he wore a T-shirt. He wore a jacket because you want to be formal when you're in these committee hearings. But underneath that, he wore a T-shirt that said "Democrats for School Choice," and he just went on that full kind of. I don't know if he's Southern Baptist, but it sort of reminded me of that, just lighting into the Democrats, calling them out for the hypocrisy of not supporting opportunities for every kid.
Yeah.
Well, you'd think because the Democrats would be in favor of choice on big issues like abortion. They want to have choice even over whether or not the child lives. How much the more wouldn't you want to have choice over education?
It does seem to be sort of self-contradictory and inconsistent, doesn't it? Especially as a philosophy professor, I can see why you would go there. But yeah, absolutely, that's exactly right. The choice here is no one's forcing you to make this choice as a parent. If you like your public school, great, keep your child there. If you like a charter school, great. By the way, we didn't get into this much, but we did actually make other changes to the ESA program. One that I think is actually quite important is that we now allow it to be used for transportation.
Oh, that's a good point. I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, and the reason for that is, if you're in one of those areas where maybe you're not close enough to a school, but the school's not allowed to pay for transportation, how are you going to pay for it if you're economically challenged, right? So that's why it's an opportunity for us to fix that issue so that these kids can actually get to a private school of their choice in a very real way.
Yeah, I think that might be one criticism is that, and you kind of already hinted at it before too, that private schools aren't in all areas yet. I know a number of people in, for example, the Great Hearts district that are putting schools everywhere they can. So that's a classical education charter school system. But someone could say, yeah, all students who have access are going to leave the public schools, and those who don't have any access are going to be stuck there, and it's just going to get worse. And so you're addressing that with having transportation costs covered. But also there's kind of an argument there, I wonder if you could speak to, which is that public school is sort of like everyone needs to be in it to keep it doing well. If half the people leave, it won't be funded enough and everyone will suffer. But then what happens is everyone's there and they want to control the curriculum in a way that half the people don't like and they want to leave.
Sure, that's one argument because our funding is per pupil at the state level already. So what happens is if you're a school district X, wherever you might be, you're going to get funding based on the number of children that attend and that are enrolled in your school district. You don't get some sort of base level funding and that no matter what, it's a per pupil funding mechanism. So because of that, you're right in the sense that if children leave, that the school district will get less funds. However, keep in mind that the average amount of the ESA, as we mentioned before, is roughly $7,000, right around there. Now, the average per pupil, well, the total per pupil without any sort of override or bond for public school is actually well north of 13,000. So almost double, or basically double what the ESA amount is. So school districts are already getting considerably more than anyone that exercises their rights under the ESA, right? So presumably moving forward. In addition to that, some of the money that goes to public schools will stay in the public school because of the way the funding mechanisms work. Again, I hinted at this before, but school finance is an incredibly complicated and unfortunately not very transparent system in Arizona, which is a whole different, again, discussion that we can have at some point in the future. But because of that, there's actually still a residual benefit from someone exercising their right under the ESA to the school district that the child left from. And then we have two other problems here. One is there's certain schools that are underpopulated within the same districts, and there are schools that are way overpopulated and oversubscribed. Up where I live, we just moved, but real close to where we are, the Liberty High School, which is a part of the Peoria school district. Up there, super crowded, over capacity, and there's demand for even more new high schools up there. But other schools in the Peoria system, the Peoria district, are at, I've heard, less than, around 50% of capacity. So even within the same district, so school districts are going to have to make choices. They're going to have to make choices, and they're going to have to pare down schools that are underperforming. And by that I mean people don't want their kids to go there for whatever reason, right? So they're going to have to make some choices, and they're going to have to change the way they're doing business. But then
even that reflects school choice somewhat, because what's happening there, I suspect, is parents are requesting within their district to go to certain schools. So they might have a school closer to home, but they know it's not that great, and they had requests to go to another one within their district. So even that proves parents want school choice.
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly what that means. Is they do want school choice. They're exercising those rights. And going back to the earlier point about private schools not being there, well, sure, they're not there because there just wasn't the economic base to support them in certain areas of the city. But now that this is universal, now all of a sudden, and maybe your local church might be the easiest one to set up because they already have a campus, and now they could take advantage of this and start maybe starts as a micro school, but then it grows from there in some format. So choice will grow, just like charters. When they first passed the charter bill, I wasn't here, but when they did, and they allowed charters, it wasn't like there was charters everywhere. Veritas, which you mentioned before, or Basis, or ALA, or any of those other big organizations, they didn't start from nothing to 25 schools, right? It took some time to get going, and I think that's it's reasonable to expect that it'll take a little bit of time. But the idea here will be that there will be, and there, just like there are now charters in economically less advantageous areas, there will be private schools in less advantageous areas. But right now, really, private schools are the exclusive domain of the rich. Really, unless
that's what's funny about it, right? The defense defending against this is just keeping the access in the hands of the rich.
Right, and that's, to me, I just don't get it. I really don't. This whole segregation thing.
No, they want to, because what's the alternative? Like trapping students in a school that's determined by their zip code. Well, that's actually going to lead, probably, I would think, to more segregation than if you allowed things to open up and gave students and parents an actual choice. I have a question for you. Another question: are you finding other states, or do you think other states are going to follow this model? I'm sure. I mean, the eyes of the nation right now are on Arizona, but Arizona is the leading state right now for school choice. But I imagine there will be other states that follow in our wake.
Well, I truly hope so. I do, and I think you're right. I think that's exactly what's going to happen, and I don't say that tongue in cheek, because I know multiple legislators have already reached out to me from some of these states that are working on something
Wonderful.
similar. The one thing is that I've said to them, and details matter when it comes to setting up a program that works. You have to be cognizant of the school finance and the kind of the way school enrollment works and everything within the state that you're doing, because some of these states are going from basically no school choice whatsoever, and they want to go straight to full-on backpack funding. Maybe, but for us, there were steps along the way. As I said, open enrollment, you can go from one district to the other, or from different schools within the same district, as we were talking about Liberty High School before. Then the charter system, the original version of the ESA, which was very limited, but because we had all of that in place, we were able to now take that final giant leap and make it universal and go to full backpack funding. Some of these states are just not there yet, so they might need to do a little bit of work on their finance side and on their structure before they can actually get to full school choice as the way we have it. Having said that, it's a nice rivalry now between us and, in a good way on this subject, between us and Florida in particular. Also Texas, the Friday Night Lights thing though is kind of a big deal in Texas. So we're trying to work through that with them. But other states have reached out as well: Wyoming, Idaho, Arkansas. I'm sorry, I'll forget some. West Virginia, they have.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's West. That's a whole different thing. They're unfortunately stuck in litigation, but I think we're going to help them. The fact that it's clearly constitutional and even now implemented here in Arizona and starting to take effect is gonna help from that perspective. So yes, it is my sincere hope that this is the beginning of school choice and backpack funding across most of this nation, if not all of it.
Oh,
well,
so.
Let me ask a question we've been talking about private school, charter school, public schools. Let me ask a question from homeschooling families. And some homeschooling families they're thankful for this idea, but they're worried that this could sometime have strings attached. Maybe you're gone, this administration's gone, and you get in a new administration and they say, you can't have this money anymore unless you do the following things. And those things very well could be contrary to these parents' faith. Could that happen?
It could. Unfortunately, it could. And the reason for that is that I can't pass a law that restricts a future legislature, right?
Yeah.
Just like I can't pass a law that's retroactive. So for those reasons, and so that just begs the point. And I'm not saying this just because the election's 2 weeks out, but it matters who's here.
Yep.
It matters quite a bit. And I think parents should and rightfully should be concerned about what could happen in the future. Having said that, I don't think that's a good excuse not to participate now. Now, if you don't want to participate, great. Again, I'm 100% for school choice, right?
It's fair choice. Yeah.
Forcing someone to participate would be ridiculous and antithetical to what I'm trying to do. But I do think that they can participate now. There really aren't strings attached at this point, other than you are, of course, signing that you're going to use, as I said before, part of the money for basic education of your child, and that you're not going to commit fraud, which seems pretty reasonable to me in terms of restrictions from a homeschool perspective. But the other I've heard kind of a nuance to that is that, but isn't it, if you participate now, aren't you sort of conditioning yourself and making yourself dependent, if you will, on these funds in order to educate your child? And then in the future, it'll be difficult to let it go should a legislature change the rules. Again, I get that argument. Having said that, these are the same parents that have already decided to homeschool in many cases and haven't been getting any benefit from the state.
So just plan ahead, plan accordingly.
So plan accordingly. And the final point, because I think this is important, is remember that there are plenty of states, unfortunately, including our neighbor California, but New York, a few others like that, that put all kinds of restrictions on homeschoolers and don't give them any benefit whatsoever already. And they went there because that's the ethos of, well, to be honest, the left in this case, but that's the ethos of the left. And so that can happen whether or not there is an ESA program. So that's why it's important to make sure that you vote for people that are not going to do that.
Yep.
Now, is there something also where if you're a homeschooling parent, to get into this program, you need to withdraw your homeschooling certificate, and then are you becoming, there's some concern like you're becoming a state educator or something? Is that going on?
So this goes to the history of the original ESA. As I understand it, I wasn't here, but when the legislature passed the original ESA program, there was the very same concern that you brought up before, that this would at some point in the future potentially lead to the state dictating curriculum or testing or whatever that you might have to do as a homeschool parent. And so at the time, in order to assuage the concerns of homeschool parents, this certificate was created. And this certificate, you file it with your, I think it's the superintendent of instruction in the county that you're in, if I understand it correctly. And so you file this certificate, and therefore you're now a homeschool parent versus a home educator, which is the other term. Now, practically, there hasn't been any difference between the two from a legal standpoint, or the state doesn't look at you any differently,
Okay.
whether you file this or not. But this was, again, it was one of those future insurance attempts, if you will. But again, nothing can prevent the future legislature from enforcing rules on filers or non-filers.
Yeah.
Going to a technical question, though, because you hinted at this, normally you would have to withdraw that and then apply for an ESA. However, the law does not require you to withdraw it in order to apply for an ESA. And so the most recent decision, which I think is the right one, just from a logistical standpoint, by the Department of Education, has been that if you apply, then that's deemed, you're basically deemed as withdrawing your certificate, because the only purpose of that certificate, really, in a very practical sense, is to say that you're not going to take state money and that you're not going to participate in the ESA. It's just a statement to that effect.
Well, and going back, something you said earlier is it's not state money.
It's
I mean,
not
technically it is, but if someone feels,
yes,
if someone, no, I don't mean that, but I just mean that someone philosophically who's, maybe more conservative, they're homeschooling for that reason, they don't want the state involved, they might say, yeah, I don't want the state's money, period. Well, I mean, it's not really the state's money, right? This is money they took from the people, and now you get to use it for education.
That's correct. And one homeschool parent just last week, she happened to have 4 children as well, Jonathan, and she said, well, yeah, but I don't pay $28,000 in state taxes, and so it's kind of a one-to-one. And I hear her heart. I mean, she's trying to be fair in some sense, but then I had to remind her, yes, but you're going to be paying those taxes. You paid them before you had children.
Yeah,
you're going to be paying them long after your children are done with education. It's not a one-to-one
right now, just right now.
We don't charge you more taxes because you have more children, or the other way around. So I get the logic, but it doesn't really work.
Yep. Were you surprised that the Save Our Schools petition failed? I'm going to be honest. I was a little surprised.
I was too.
I was bracing myself.
I want to hear what you did. I want to hear what you did, because I was surprised.
So I have to tell you, gentlemen, that when I started, it was my brother and I that triggered this in my mind at the beginning of this session. And he said, why don't you guys go swing for the fences and do something really big? And we had conversation with friends of school choice, people that I trust that have been involved with every expansion of school choice in this state, from the original open enrollment and so on, as I said before. And everybody counseled us. The two of us, we had lunch with a couple of these people together, and then subsequent conversations after, and said, look, even if you're somehow successful, first of all, you're not going to be successful. But even if you are successful, it's going to get challenged, because they challenged it in 2018, if you remember, with that ESA expansion, and they're going to get the signatures, and then you're going to fail at the ballot. And I took it to heart, and I don't, we prayed about it, we thought about it, I thought about it, prayed about it, and I said, you know what? There's going to be overwhelming pressure to give more money to K-12 in this budget, because we had a pretty big surplus. If we're going to do that, I want to do something big for parents, and I want to do something big on school choice. And I think the time is right. I think, you saw what happened in Virginia. You saw what happened in Iowa on the Republican side, where a governor that was pro school choice got involved in primaries and replaced 8 out of 9 Republicans that opposed school choice in a primary in Iowa. And that was all kind of happening all at this time. And I thought, if we can't win now, even if we somehow pass it, even if they get the signatures and we get it on the ballot, if we can't win this issue now, then to be honest with you, I thought we should just give up this issue
Hmm.
and just not worry about this anymore if we can't win it in this environment. And so, to answer your question, that was a long way of saying it. I I was I wasn't really all that surprised, but I was definitely relieved
Yeah.
that they didn't get the signatures. And there were parents out there. And by the way, Goldwater Institute, American Federation for Children,
Yeah.
Heritage. There's a few groups out there that really got behind this to help out. And this is a team effort. It really is. But the parents that went out there and held up signs,
Yeah.
and I actually joined them for a couple of days out there, and to have people with their children, parents out there with their children, many of them were special needs kids because these are parents that were on ESAs already and saw how beneficial this was. Remember being in front of a Tempe changing hands out there, and people driving by, people doing some pretty nasty things, including flipping off little kids, which and screaming at them obscenities. It's while you remember those, there were also lots of parents that were honking and waving and
Yeah.
smiling too
Yeah.
at the same time.
Yeah.
So it was a team effort to get it done. And again, I can't say I'm entirely surprised, but I'm definitely relieved, and I think it speaks volumes that they weren't able to stop it.
Mhm. Well, I got one more question for you, which is from before we started recording, you and I were talking about education, and you brought up critical thinking. And you were talking a little about how students need to do critical thinking. And I thought that was great. And I wondered if you would tell everybody, what is that? Why is critical thinking important? And how does this help advance our ability to get students to critically think?
Well, I think critical thinking is, well, for lack of a better word, critical. I mean, to success, critical to advancement. I understand there's been, because of say past abuse and politicization, if that's the right word, of the humanities, that often legislators and policymakers and even business owners and so on want to try to go to more of the hard sciences, thinking that they're more objective, and I get why they do that, but the problem with that is if you understand that 2 + 2 is 4 and that makes sense, but you don't understand why. So you have to understand why that is and why that matters, and that's the part that critical thinking plays. So I'm a huge fan of the humanities, specifically of philosophy. I'm actually a bit of a history buff too. So in that sense,
You're in the right place.
yeah, exactly. So I love that. But to me, being able to, so for example, I'll give you a perfect example of this for my personal thing. I had a really hard time with math in college. It wasn't my thing. I just never learned it right. So much of math is process, and at the wrong time, I had the wrong setup, and I couldn't learn math very well. And so because of that, I always struggled with math. And actually, what I struggled with more of was algebra more than I did anything else. I was actually sort of naturally good at trig and at some of those higher level maths that are really about critical thinking, actually. But so, and yet my job out of college was to model and to predict statistically what the finances of our division at American Express, billions of dollars, is going to do. And I did that job successfully for 13 years, and I decided to finally leave and start my own business. But it was all math. It was all modeling. It was all high level stuff too. And I got to tell you, my colleagues were Harvard MBAs for the most part, out of New York, or Columbia or wherever. But I was terrible at math. So how does this work? How does that happen? Well, the one thing I learned is a couple things about math. One, the concept of estimating. I still remember it. I was in 7th grade when I learned the concept of estimating. And I remember the teacher explaining it to me. It just made perfect sense to me. You can't imagine how many things we saved that were incorrect, because I'm just looking at this going, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. It's far off. It doesn't make sense. And it's a math problem. And yet we're able to use critical thinking to figure out that something was wrong in what we were doing long term. And by the way, when you're wrong long term and you're billions of dollars that you're dealing with, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars worth of mistakes. So you can't do that. You're going to make the wrong investment. It's gonna cost the company or you personally a lot of money when you do that, and you do it the wrong way. So to me, it's incredibly important that you're able to logically follow an argument, calling out the hypocrisy, for example. Maybe hypocrisy is too strong of a word. The inconsistency, shall we say, in some of these arguments. As you said before, Democrats all about pro-choice when it comes to abortion, but they're not pro-choice when it comes to this. It's like, well, you can't do both. Or ESG, I don't know if that's a term you guys are familiar with. But so we had two bills, real short example, this past session. One was on the Republican side, forcing banks to bank gun manufacturers. The other was forcing the state not to do business with banks that promote ESG. Well, the same people were making opposite arguments for one bill and then the other. And it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, when you call them out, they're kind of like, okay. Is she, well, I see what you're saying, and then so the thing just kind of dies. But ultimately, calling people out has been helpful in that sense.
Helps you see, I guess critical thinking helps you live with integrity.
It does. And it helps you, it helps you actually analyze your own thought process, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I know, as an educator, philosophy professor, I want to expose people to every view out there and also teach them how to think about those views. So I think sometimes the impression for things like school choice is that parents want to sequester their children and not let them hear anything at all. And that's not been my experience with parents or myself. They want their kids to hear all the views, but what they've seen in the public schools is that that's not what happens. Yeah. And so this will be a chance actually to let students hear more views and learn how to think about them.
I agree with that. One of the things that, in talking to my wife about this, because obviously we have the girls as well, and they, I want them to hear those opposing viewpoints in school, and I want them to be exposed to certain things within reason, of course, and other philosophies, and I want them to talk to me about it, because then, in the safety of the home, in the safety of oversight, not in an overbearing sense, but just in a guidance way, we can have those conversations and talk those things through. Utilitarian philosophy as an example. Well, it's great. You're going to save the one or save the 100, right? That the usual problems when you have those types of discussions will go, well, yeah, but what if the one is your child, right? As opposed to the 100. Well, all of a sudden it's, the calculus changes, and then of course, people, not to get too philosophical on you, but people make all kinds of statements, and they around here, especially on the Republican side, you see people that are, well, I'm a libertarian at heart. I'm a libertarian. Yeah, okay, you're a libertarian until someone cheats you out of something, and then all of a sudden you're demanding justice, right? And I'm not talking about legally, but I'm talking about in terms of, well, why did they get this benefit from the government and I didn't get this benefit from the government? So all of a sudden there's these big debates, and look, practically what you do to me matters as much as what you say. And being able to again critically think and to plan out and to acknowledge that there are problems with someone's thought process or logic is incredibly important long term to getting good policy done. And obviously, when you're talking about the hard sciences, you want something that's actually objectively true, as opposed to just how I feel about it.
Yeah. John, any more questions?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, you're a hero to many parents here in Arizona, and you did a lot of heavy lifting here, of course, sponsoring this bill. And yeah, just congratulations on the success in getting this passed. And are there any closing things you would like to say before we go?
Just that this really was, as I said before, a team effort and a build on the successes of the past of others as well, and I want to acknowledge that.
Mhm.
You know, again, we couldn't have gone from 0 to 100. You know, we went from 50 to 100, but there was a lot of work to get to 50.
Yep.
It may not even be the perfect analogy, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's important. And you know, members took tough votes to make this happen. And while I did you know, design it and we got it across the finish line, we needed everybody's support. As I mentioned, those organizations, Love Your School. There's lots of other organizations that were part of it that I didn't mention before. The governor was actually very supportive of a full expansion, in spite of the fact that, again, nobody thought we could do it. Once it was clear that it was happening, everybody rolled up their sleeves and went to work to defend it and to help it across the finish line. So in that sense, this is actually a very big win for all parents, and hopefully not just in Arizona. You know, for now in Arizona, but for in the very near future here, I hope more and more states will start making steps in this direction and eventually getting to where we are.
Thank you for being here so much.
Yeah.
And yeah, this was a great conversation, great discussion, and I'm sure that everyone watching is going to enjoy this. I want to mention that although Dr. Barth and I are employed at ASU, this is not an ASU program. These are our own opinions and our own interests. And the Reform Devils is interviewing Representative Toma today because we think educational choice is great. We want parents to be involved in their children's lives, and we want parents to have the ability to choose what education they think is best and not be told by somebody else what they should do. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.